Now on 5, imagine waking up and finding yourself in the morgue. Well, that's what happened to one woman not once, but twice. This is Premature Burial.
I have been pronounced dead. I have woken up in the morgue.
The feeling of lying next to two bodies that were very mutilated and very dead.
Washed me and began my autopsy. They began to cut my chest.
I'll never get over it.
It could happen to Mum, or it could happen to anybody.
You realise that yes, this can happen.
Be put in a coffin, it could even be buried alive.
We'll never know how many people have been buried alive, but it's probably more common than we might expect. Diagnosing death can be difficult. The line between life and death can be a very fine one, and the fear of being prematurely buried is as old as man himself. Over the years, evidence suggests that this fear can turn into reality. With modern medical technology, it's hard to imagine that anyone could be buried alive today. But no system is perfect, and getting a diagnosis wrong could mean the difference between waking up in a hospital bed or coming round in a coffin. Alison Birchall lives in Melbourne, Australia, but today with her son Stephen, she's visiting her native England to recall a terrifying incident from the 1950s, which was to change her life forever.
I decided to go to the pictures to see it as then. I thought they were funny, Bud Abbott and Lou Costello.
It's 1956, and like most youngsters of the time, Alison loved going to the movies.
I sat in the back row and the film commenced.
Her favourite films were comedies, in particular those featuring Abbott and Costello, who used to make a roar with laughter. Alison laughed along with everyone else, until suddenly she began to feel very unwell.
I remember laughing that much and falling to the ground. I could still hear the film going and everybody laughing, but I'm just laying there not being able to do anything. The film finished and everybody got up and home, and it was one of the usherettes that found me on the floor in the back seat of the cinema.
Alison had collapsed on the floor and fallen into a deep coma.
An ambulance was called. I was taken to the hospital.
Let's get her out. Okay, come on. How long has she been like this?
I don't know, I've just found
Watch the
her.
door.
And they put me in the ward for a time, and then after that, the sister told the nurses to prepare me for the morgue, because they had pronounced me dead. And I was petrified.
Alison Birchall had been examined and pronounced dead, having displayed no apparent signs of life. Two nurses began to prepare her body for the morgue. What they didn't realize was that although she appeared dead, in fact, she was alive, yet unable to move or communicate.
Whilst I was in the trance and the nurses were getting me prepared for the morgue, they were holding a conversation about their boyfriends.
You're asking me to do things I've just never done before.
What they did, what they shouldn't do, and everything. Of course, they had no idea that I could hear everything they were saying. I was just paralysed, and I just had to sort of go along. At the same time, telling myself to hurry up, come out of it, you know. And they proceeded to take me to the morgue. And I knew there were people, or must be people around me that were dead, but I wasn't. And I kept fighting to telling myself, come out of this. And I laid there thinking, what's the next step to being in the morgue? Which was frightening itself. Anyway, I did finally come out of it. And I sat up and looked around and saw these corpses. I just didn't know what to do, so I just sat there. And then the attendant came in, and I think he got a bigger shock when I sort of coughed and asked if I could go back to the ward. The next thing I knew, the two nurses had come down to take me back to the ward.
Nurse, I recognise your voice.
We were looking after you.
Nurse, you know what you were talking about earlier? I agree with what the other nurse said. You ought to finish with him.
And she looked at me in amazement and I said, yes, I heard everything. I said, but don't worry, I won't tell anyone. I consequently got discharged from the hospital and that started a chain of events which led up to my having to start a whole new life.
We hold quite dear the notion that there is a very big divide between the living and the dead. And the proximity to death itself and to dead people is, in the mind of most people, a kind of contaminant. Something that is not expected and something that's very unpleasant if it does happen.
I sat up and remember seeing the bodies of people that were dead, but I wasn't.
The reaction of any normal human being to finding themselves in close proximity to dead people is to be shocked and to be quite disturbed by it. And that's the beginning of traumatic shock.
Understandably, the experience left the young Alison wondering if she would ever again come this close to being buried alive. Stephen Castledine was born in England, but has spent much of his adult life as a teacher, working around the world. We caught up with him in Germany, where he's been teaching at an international school, so he could tell us his horrific story. Bangkok, Thailand, 1991, and Stephen Castledine makes his way home through the bustling side streets of the city, unaware of the traumatic events that were about to unfold.
I was riding home on my motorbike in Bangkok, and maybe I was 2 or 3 minutes from home, about 11:30 one Friday evening, and I had to stop at a crossroads, feeling very relaxed. And one of the most extraordinary events occurred that really made me look at my own eternity in a very different light. There was an accident in front of me involving a cement truck and a taxi. I've only managed to piece all of these together after the event. The cement truck had come through the lights at red and hit the taxi. And the taxi spun round and hit me. And I was left unconscious. I certainly did not cut a very fine picture whatsoever, with a dislocated shoulder and cracked clavicle, collarbone and some broken ribs, and my face was very bloody. Because of the nature of the accident, neither of the taxi driver nor the cement truck driver stopped. I was eventually taken to hospital by a rogue ambulance. The rogue ambulance service, as far as I know, is certainly unmonitored and unregistered. The scary aspect is that you're a victim of a road accident and probably manhandled in the back of these ambulances, and they're taking you to hospital for monetary return. In the ambulance were 2 dead bodies from another motorcycle accident. During the course of the journey from where I had my accident to the General Hospital, I have very strong images of the 2 dead bodies that were in close proximity, were actually touching each other, lying on the floor of the ambulance. And I was obviously going in and out of consciousness because some of the images were so strong. And then the next feeling of consciousness that I had was waking up in a major hospital in Bangkok and the entrance to a mortuary. I tried to get off my stretcher, wondering where the hell I was. And a doctor came and he tried to explain to me that I'd been involved in a serious accident. And I kept looking at these 2 dead bodies that were still on either side of me, wondering what these bodies were, where they'd come from, and where was I. And he said that he didn't know who I was because I had no identification, which confused me even more. For the first maybe 2 days, I was quite keen and to want to talk about it. And then there was a real mental block. I couldn't even revisit the incident in my own mind. And slowly, when I started to talk to people that were around or live around where the accident took place, I started to piece together what had actually happened.
His mind is trying to tell him that he must face what's happened to him. And in fact, it looks as if he's recalling more and more as time goes by about the experiences he had.
The next 6 months was possibly the worst time, because I then could reflect upon the incident. I knew exactly what had happened, and I knew that I was within a whisker of dying. When I look back and reflect upon the incident as a whole, then possibly the most unnerving aspect is the travelling in an ambulance with 2 dead bodies on either side of me, and for them, of course, there was no return, and to be in such close proximity physically to 2 dead bodies is a very ghoulish feeling, and something that it took a long time for that image to be shaken and to be put into some realistic terms. But it was a very creepy experience.
People will begin to have flashbacks. Now, some people begin to have dreams about the situation or variants of it. Other people have waking flashbacks where they actually re-experience what's happened to them. And that is your mind, or their mind, telling them that they must confront what's happened to them.
The last moments of your life are spent without having any direct contact with people that know you. And to die in that sort of lonely atmosphere and an atmosphere of alienation is a very disturbing feeling.
Flashbacks are only part of the problem for people like Stephen and Alison. The prospect of being misdiagnosed as being dead can cause all sorts of problems. But perhaps the most serious is that of actually being buried alive.
He had heard the sound of the earth shoveled into the coffin when it had been put into the grave.
Many of us have a fear of death. Some have a real fear of being buried alive. This fear holds a morbid fascination for Rodney Davies. Rodney grew up in an apartment above his stepfather's funeral home, where he often watched the proceedings in the yard below. Now a successful author, he's written a book called Buried Alive, and believes that certainly in the past, premature burial was a very common occurrence. Of the stories in Rodney's book, the tale of George Hayward is perhaps the most frightening.
George Hayward was a rich Gloucestershire farmer's son, and when he was a teenager or a youth, he was helping out one day in his father's fields.
Come on, lads.
And he was unfortunately stabbed in the cranium with a tine of a pitchfork wielded by one of the labourers, which penetrated his skull. Ah!
Get help from the house.
Help!
George!
Help!
George! Speak to me. George!
The injury didn't seem to be all that serious at first. Obviously, he bled a lot and was a bit discombobulated by it. But he didn't seem to need any special treatment. But however, in the following days, he started to feel rather unwell and was eventually put to bed. He continued to deteriorate. He eventually developed pleurisy. George was lying on his bed, but his eyes were partly opened, and so he was able to see all that was going on around him. He heard the doctors declare him to be dead. He saw his mother, father, and siblings come and bend over him. He felt his mother kiss him. He felt tears dropping on his face. He had experienced himself being measured by the undertaker and put in a coffin, taken to his grave.
Young George Hayward was about to be buried alive. Whilst he was totally paralyzed and displayed no obvious signs of life, he was alive and began to realize his impending fate. He heard the cries of his family and friends. He wanted desperately to let them know he was still alive. Unable to move or communicate, George Hayward was committed to the ground.
He had heard the sound of the earth shoveled into the coffin when it had been put into the grave. And there he lay for quite a number of hours. He gradually lost consciousness, but then almost immediately after the burial, the two doctors began arguing really quite fiercely about what caused his death. One said it was a direct result of the fact he'd been stabbed in the cranium.
But the wound in the head was so deep.
And the other one said, no, it wasn't that, because the wound wasn't really serious enough, but it was caused by the pleurisy.
He is certain to have had an infection which has invaded his whole body. Therefore, a pleurisy will have set in.
In the end, because neither doctor would admit that the other might possibly be right, they decided to dig him up, exhume him, and do an autopsy. George was finally brought back into consciousness by the sound of the spade scraping along the top of the coffin as he was being exhumed. He was removed from the grave, taken to a special room. Doctors had prepared to do the work. In the dissecting room, he saw the doctors bending over him, both of whom were holding scalpels.
I'll expose the thorax so that we can see his lungs.
He felt one of them pull out his tongue, and this so alarmed him that they were about to cut him up, that he was able, by a great effort of will, to move his eyelids, just by a fraction. Unfortunately, one of the doctors saw it.
Stop, you idiot. His eyes are opening.
And said, look, he's still alive.
My God! He's alive!
My goodness. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, son?
Is he alive?
There's a pulse.
And that apprised him of the fact that he was still alive, and they took the necessary measures and managed to bring him back to full consciousness and to restore him to health.
George Hayward had a lucky escape, but if Rodney's claims are to be believed, thousands of soldiers in World War II weren't so lucky. Davies has based part of his book on evidence from French scientist Louis-Claude Vincent, who maintains he witnessed a shocking series of events during a project relating to American war graves in Europe in the 1950s. Dr. Louis-Claude Vincent was an expert in his field and was carrying out checks on the water supplies needed to maintain American war dead cemeteries in France and elsewhere in Europe. Whilst carrying out his duties, he made an alarming discovery, which was, and still is, shrouded in mystery.
He noticed that there were strange, large wooden huts had been constructed, into which the bodies were being taken after being exhumed from the grave. The skeleton remains of the person who had previously been dug up and had been wired up, laid out properly, re-emerging, buried in lead coffins. Louis-Claude Vincent eventually discovered that this was a top-secret project organized by the US Army to determine how many soldiers had been inadvertently buried alive. And it was found that of the 150,000 servicemen and women who had been exhumed, no less than 4%, in other words, 6,000 individuals, had been prematurely buried. And they were able to tell this by the fact that the remains in the coffin had moved, very often to turn themselves over, or their arms and legs were in abnormal positions. Sometimes there were scrapings on the interior surface of the coffin.
Despite Rodney's reference to Vincent's claims, we've been unable to find any strong evidence in support. The American Embassy in London refused to comment and would not provide us with a statement.
Louis-Claude Vincent discovered it really quite by accident, only because he happened to be at these cemeteries at the particular time that the work was taking place. And that was his own account of what he found out. Now, if it's denied, well, then all I can say is, well, you would expect it to be denied, because the results were so horrifying that they wouldn't want the general public to know about it.
Julian Lytton has spent his life researching what happens to us in death, and he doesn't have faith in signs offered by people like Rodney Davies as evidence of premature burial.
Where they tell you about scratch marks on the lid. and other hideous signs of somebody trying to get out. Please don't believe it. It's not at all true. What is happening is that the marks that you see on the inside of the lid of the coffin are caused by the decomposition of the body itself. The general mark, which is tried to be identified as an argument for premature burial, that which is 1/3 of the way down from the head of the lid end of the coffin, is, if you think about it, that bit which is exactly over your stomach, where all your soft tissues are, those that rot first and bubble up first. And they're the ones that burst first and leave these corrosive acids which are going to be on the lid. So the damage which is done to the lid is really done by us as part of our decomposition process and has nothing whatsoever to do with any ideas of premature burial.
Nonetheless, Lytton agrees that on the battlefield, diagnosing death could be very difficult.
If you only have the space of something like 1 hour to 90 minutes to collect as many as 1,000 persons from a battlefield, it stands to reason that there may have been a percentage of those persons who were not dead, but they were not in such a field or in such a medical situation to be so carefully examined, to have been pronounced damaged rather than dead itself. And so it is possible that some of those soldiers could have been buried when they were still alive.
Modern evidence of people actually being buried alive is thin on the ground, but for some, that very moment can come too close for comfort.
I have been pronounced dead. I have woken up in the morgue, and it is very terrifying to do that.
Alison Birchall hoped that her close encounter with the prospect of being buried alive would be a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. Some 10 years later, she was to get even closer to the grave.
The second time I woke up in the morgue, it was slightly different. It was off from the hospital, and when the door shut, it felt like being enclosed in a tomb, because I knew I'd come from the daylight into the dark. When those doors closed, it was unbelievable. I didn't know how many corpses there were around me, or if there were any. All I knew was that they're dead, I'm not, you know, I'm alive, and I've got to get out of here. As I was laying there, I thought, what's the next move if I don't come out in time? How long do I have to stay here before somebody comes and removes me, either for autopsy or to measure me for a coffin? And I had to fight to get will myself to come out of this trance. Finally, I did come out of my trance. I couldn't stay where I was. I had to get up. It was utter darkness and I couldn't see a thing. I remember when I was taken in there, I went down a little bit and then turned so. When I got off the slab, I did the same thing. I turned a little bit and walked straight. I came to the door. It was locked. I banged on it, but there was nobody there that could hear me. While I was waiting to get out, it suddenly dawned on me, when and how long am I going to stand there? Someone's got to die before they come and open these doors. I was wishing then that somebody would die, but not in a malicious way, but knowing that would be the only way those doors would open if somebody died and somebody was to bring them down to me. Who else visits the morgue? It's the only way in if you're dead. When the door opened, I was pale like a shot. I didn't look behind me twice then. I just went. And I went back to the ward and I was released from hospital a day later.
Well, Alison's situation is really tragic because her trauma isn't just to do with an event that's happened in the past and has gone away and is fearful and may recur. It's an event that will recur in all probability.
I suffer from a very rare condition called narcolepsy cataplexy. The narcolepsy is a sleeping sickness which is controlled by tablets.
Cataplexy is a response in which, in response to some sort of sudden thing happening to you, like say a fright or a shout or a noise, suddenly your body goes completely limp. You lose loss of use of all your voluntary muscles, so you would fall over, and often you can't talk. But you're actually conscious. You're aware of all the things that are going on, but you just fall in a heap on the ground.
You'd be like looking at a dead person. You'd go to feel for pulses, and there is none. All the vital organs slow right down, and to every intent you'd be thinking you were looking at a dead person. There is no way that I can convey to you that I know what you're doing and I can hear everything that's going on around me. And I have woken up in a morgue, pronounced dead, and knowing that I'm not, and I'm lying there where people are, it is the most terrifying experience.
Her fear of re-traumatisation and re-victimisation is very rational. It's absolutely based on what probably will happen. She attempts to deal with that by living a normal life, by being busy, but inevitably there is this fear in the back of her mind.
Well, I sort of realised then it was something I had to live with.
Conditions like catalepsy, or cataplexy as it's sometimes called, are very rare. However, some of us are so worried about the prospect of being buried alive that we leave special instructions in our wills.
When I first started at the mortuary 26 years ago, we had several requests from people who'd left it in their will to have a major artery severed because of their fear of being buried or cremated alive. I don't believe in premature burial. I don't think it would happen nowadays. I don't believe it's ever happened at all. Doctors are very well trained, body is examined well. Between a person dying and being brought into the mortuary is usually 6 to 8 hours. By the time the doctors come to the scene, a certified death, and then a funeral director is called. A body can have been dead at least 8 hours, I suppose. Hypostasis could have started by then. This is a good example of hypostasis, hypostatic staining. The pinkness on the chest and the abdomen. You can see where he's leant on something as he's died and he's dying. And that will never go. The staining will stay there. Same as the hands staining. As you can see, the blueness is the stagnant blood which has settled to the lowest level. If you see this in a person, you know that they are dead. The only way you would get rid of that is by embalming. The embalming pushes out the stagnant blood and replaces it with the formaldehyde. Would also fill out the skin, which has lost its water content. This hand is quite floppy. The rigor mortis has come off on this hand, whereas this one, the knuckles of the fingers are still quite bent, but it's getting soft now, so the fingers could be straightened. When someone's newly dead and you move them to either put them in a stretcher with the undertakers or to undress them when they come into the mortuary, the last expel of air can come out as if the person is breathing. People do worry. Bodies don't move on their own. They don't sit up. People say, does the hair grow after death? Like a man's beard? And it doesn't. What happens is the skin retracts, and if a man has died with a little bit of stubble, by the time the relatives see him and he hasn't been shaved, then that stubble looks like a 2 or 3 day old beard. The skin has just retracted back, the water content has gone, and the stubble is more prominent on the face. It's the same with the fingers. The nails don't keep growing, they'll go blue with the hypostasis, and the skin just retracts down from the nail.
Should the diagnosis of death be as easy as Elsie suggests, doctors can and do get it wrong, and when they do, the consequences can be very grave. Maureen Jones lives in the picture postcard town of Bridlington on the East Yorkshire coast. With her daughter Karen, she recalls an event from 1996 that was to have a devastating effect on the whole family. A widow, Maureen lived alone in a nearby village.
I got ready for bed one night, and that is all I remember then. The rest is what I've been told.
As Maureen got ready for bed, she suddenly began to feel increasingly unwell. She staggered from the window and fell face down on the floor by the side of her bed. There she lay for many hours, all through the night and into the next morning.
My son had come down to see me. Well, he came to feed the dogs and called in as he usually does.
Her son Neil kept his dogs at his mother's house and called every morning to feed them.
And he couldn't get any reply. And he thought, oh, I was out shopping.
Unaware of his mother's condition, Neil carried on about his business.
He tried again to get me and couldn't. He realised something must be wrong then, and he came down and came upstairs.
And he found Mum laying face down on the side of the bed.
Mum? Mum, you all right? What's up, Mum?
At which point he called a doctor.
Oh, can I speak to a doctor, please?
The doctor pronounced Maureen Jones dead. The police were called as a matter of course, as Maureen had apparently suffered a sudden death.
I was told that the mother had died suddenly because we'd taken some time to get there. The doctor was already on the scene and had pronounced Maureen Jones dead.
She didn't use a stethoscope, she didn't look in my eyes, and she didn't turn me over. But she said I was dead and called the hearse.
Maureen Jones's body was lying face down.
And the policeman who was upstairs called his colleague up. He'd seen Mum's leg twitching.
Phil? Phil, come up here.
I'm very sorry.
Phil, can you come upstairs?
Excuse me.
He'd seen my mum move. She'd been pronounced dead, and he'd seen my mum move.
With my colleague, we turned her over onto her back, and there was no response, and she had all the appearance of being dead. But her eyes were still open, and the thing that really grabbed me was...
He said I didn't have the eyes of a dead woman even.
It's almost as if their soul has left them. What I did notice, however, because she was only partially clothed, that blood had started to pool at the lower part of the body, which is a normal indication that somebody has died. I had a brief chat with my colleague and I said that I wanted to do some artificial resuscitation and then started a heart massage. And I'd done about 4 pumps, and it appeared as if Maureen Jones suddenly drew in some air. My colleague and I sort of was wondering what was going on, really. It was a very tricky period then, because basically we'd been told by a professional person who we had no reason to disbelieve that this woman was dead, and now it appeared that she was alive.
Called an ambulance. Apparently she wasn't dead at all.
The next thing we had was a doorbell going down the stairs, and then we had a call from the family saying that the undertakers had arrived. And obviously, the next course of action, had this interruption not taken place, Maureen Jones would have basically been put in a coffin and taken to the mortuary. Undoubtedly, if she had been zipped up in the bag, which she would have done, she wouldn't be here now.
It transpired that she'd actually been in a diabetic coma. She was suffering from hypothermia, and she made a full recovery in Scarborough Hospital.
I'll never get over it.
And none of us will ever forget what happened on that night.
And I know it's hard for the family.
Neil was definitely traumatised by it.
But being selfish, it's harder for me.
It was a terrible thing to find your mum supposedly dead and being told she'd died, then being told it was a mistake and she hadn't. It doesn't really bear thinking about what might have happened had that policeman not seen my mum's leg move. She could have come to in a coffin, not known where she was, and suffocated probably, and none of us would be any wiser. Mum would have had the fear of being in a coffin alive.
Here we have somebody in a hypoglycemic coma. You would still use your same criteria for determining death as you would with anybody else. I don't see how you could not detect eye changes, some sort of pulse, listening to the heart, seeing if there's some breathing going on. Some of those things must be happening, or else the person would be dead. And if you examine somebody carefully and assiduously, you should pick it up. You really should pick it up.
The doctor who pronounced Maureen Jones dead has since faced disciplinary action and was found negligent in not carrying out a thorough examination of her patient. The prospect of being prematurely buried happening once in a lifetime is bad enough. For Alison Birchall, she's had to get used to living with a condition that leaves her with no apparent signs of life and has now been pronounced dead 3 times.
The third time I was pronounced dead was in the mid-70s. I was living in Australia. I'd had an attack. That was the most frightening because although they were frightening in England, at least I was only on a slab. This being Australia, they don't just put you on a slab, they put you into a cold unit. The neighbour had called the ambulance and I was worried that if I wasn't dead when I went in, I would be when I come out, I'd be frozen to death. I can hear everything going on around me, but there is no way that I can convey to anyone that I can hear, I can respond.
No, she's gone, mate. Get the stretcher, eh?
It's amazing, you know, to think someone like myself can be pronounced dead, but it is true, you can be. At that time, my son, Stephen, had just come home.
What's happened? Mum?
Ambulance was there and loading Mum up in the back. And I basically said, what's going on? They said that your mum's passed away. It's too late.
No, no, you don't understand. Settle down, mate. We've done all we can. Look, you've got to believe me, she's not dead.
So I think she's had an attack. I said she suffers from narcolepsy, epilepsy.
She's got this condition, right, where she collapses, it looks like she's dead, but she's not, please.
Look, mate, we've tested the pulse, she's gone, okay? There's nothing we can do.
Look, mate, you've got to believe me, she's not dead.
It's very hard for a 15-year-old to try and tell ambulance officers what's going on. I mean, they just think I'm an hysterical 15-year-old.
Mate, we're taking her to the hospital. If you want to come, hop in the back.
Mum?
And I remembered saying to myself, that's right, Steve, keep pleading, because if I'm not dead when I go in that icebox, I will be when I come out, I'll be frozen.
She's not dead, please, you've got to believe me.
We've done all we can, haven't we?
And it was with his pleading, because he had got to such a state, that they did put me into a cubicle.
Please, she's not dead. Mum, you're a doctor. There must be something you can do.
As far as they were concerned, she was dead. And all my protests and screaming and carrying on didn't have a lot of sway. But I just wasn't going to leave that hospital without making sure that she was awake.
Just give it a couple of minutes and she'll come round. Please believe me.
From the morgue, yeah.
I was petrified, knowing that any minute now they could come and carry me off and put me into a morgue.
Look, see!
It was through Stephen's pleading that they didn't that time.
See, I said everything was going to be fine. Look, she's alive. Look, check her out, come on. Mum.
It was lucky that I was there, because I think if I hadn't been there, Mum would very well have been put into a cold storage.
It was terrifying, and I'll never wish to go through that again.
From Mum's point of view, it's got to be hell to have this condition and hear every single word that's going on around you and not be able to communicate. And then having people say she's dead, take her to the mortuary, go to the mortuary and then wake up around other dead bodies. And you're alive, and you're entombed. I can't think of anything more frightening.
It's just a thing that I know is there, could happen, and if it does, it does. And If it doesn't, it doesn't.
Mum puts on a brave face, you know, I'll live with it and this and that. But it frightens the hell out of me that she'll have an attack when no one else is there.
And I think my worst fear was if it ever happened, being buried alive.
Alison believed she would have died if the Australian paramedics had put her into an airtight fridge on that hot summer's day.
I've heard many stories of people supposedly waking up in funeral directors' premises many days after the death, and I do not see how that can possibly happen. Most funeral directors now, to look after the deceased between the time of death and the day of the funeral, either embalm, which involves, amongst other things, the severing of a major artery, or keep the deceased in a cold room, in a cold facility, which is just marginally above freezing. I really don't think it's possible for someone to live many days in that sort of environment.
Whether it's possible today is one thing, but in the 1970s, it certainly seemed possible in the former Soviet Union, as George Rodenayer found out. These days, George is a Methodist minister in Magnolia Springs, Texas, but he used to live and work as a pioneering doctor in Georgia, Eastern Europe. In 1976, George says he was considered a dissident by the Soviet regime under which he lived. Fearing he would defect whilst on an exchange visit to the United States, he believes the authorities arranged for him to disappear on the day he was due to fly out of the country.
I was on a sidewalk waiting for a cab when this car runs over me. First thing I felt after this car jumped on the sidewalk was a hit and pain. I fell down and this car runs over me, backs, runs over me again, then opens the door and runs away. I don't remember this. I remember only a hit. I remember it hit me and I fly.
George's family and friends ran to his aid. His wife, however, was already at the airport, unaware of the events taking place outside their apartment.
Standing in airport, waiting for husband with baby, and all the relatives over there waiting for him, and suddenly somebody comes and brings news. He was in a car accident. It was shock for me. Everybody went to hospital. I went in his room. I could not believe it.
I was declared dead. I was put in fridge, and I was there for 3 days.
All that time, I was sitting at home alone. My thoughts was around him.
George was declared dead, and a death certificate was issued to his wife and family. He spent the weekend in the mortuary fridge, and an autopsy was arranged for the following Monday morning. George's uncle was a well-known surgeon in the local hospital, and he insisted on being present during the examination.
They began to cut my chest, and when they cut under my breast, I opened eyes. And this doctor looked down and closed it. And I opened it again, and he said I was alive, and they did resuscitation. So that's how I came back to life.
Despite being run over by a car and spending 3 days in a mortuary refrigerator, George Rodenayer was still alive.
The death experience itself for family and friends was devastating. How could it be possible that somebody died and came back?
George was rushed to intensive care, and he spent 9 long months in hospital recovering from his ordeal. When he eventually returned home, his wife wasn't sure what to expect.
I was afraid what person he was. When he came back from the hospital, everything went fine. Only one change, what I find, he gets more religious.
Who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. After near-death experience, my life changed. I became a religious, and it was shock. I never was. Something really changed. I became a really believing God.
Previously an agnostic, George became a devout Christian and believes he was killed by the car that ran over him, and that the reason he's alive today is due to divine intervention.
I remember it hit me and I fly. And then I saw some figure in a car from the window, and that's it. It's blank. I was in darkness. There was this little hall in this darkness, and the light was not coming in. Light was there outside. So I went into that light, and I got into incredible, shiny, bright light, and I felt love. I felt eternal orgasmic feeling that you are in seventh heaven. My God, I feel so well, so good. Then I see that I'm dead, you know, and I'm happy with that. And what happened next was absolutely unimaginable and very disturbing. It was that some power, some energy pushed me through the neck and pushed me down into this body. I'm going down into the body, and suddenly I feel that everything, all body is in ache. And I open eyes, and suddenly this guy comes and closes. And what do you think? I was furious, but I cannot say anything, I cannot do anything. I was not scared of being dead because I already saw it. And it was so good for me that I'm not scared of anything anymore.
George often shares his story with his congregation in Texas, where he teaches religious education and practices as a Methodist minister. He assures everyone that there is nothing to fear about death.
I would be very happy to be dead, but God didn't allow me to be dead, so I was still alive.
One of the fascinating things about people who have had to face severely traumatic situations is that some of them will lose their faith and some of them will find their faith. And this is what seems to have happened in George's case. He has reconstructed or constructed his experience in terms of religion and religious experience. And it's quite amazing that he really thinks and believes indeed that this was an act of God, that he was brought back from the dead, because he seems to have had an out-of-body experience as well as everything else that happened to him, in order to do God's work in the world. And that is one way of resolving the mystery of why this happened to me. What is the justice of it? Does it make sense?
It's easy to be skeptical about the story of George Rodenaire. We have confirmed the death certificate is authentic, and according to the translation, they believed him dead. He bears the scars of the accident and the initial incision from his post-mortem, and the experts agree that it is possible for someone to survive for 3 days in a mortuary fridge.
All I can say is that the way the body works to preserve itself in extremes of heat and cold, if we take the cold end of things, obviously, what would happen is that probably his heart rate would go down, his respiration rate would go down, and all these things slow the body processes. And in so doing, he managed to preserve himself for 3 days without food, without water, in very antisocial conditions. And that's how it would have happened. And the fact that he was proclaimed dead at the scene is just a sad fluke, but a fluke it was.
Exhumations today are very rare, and the chances of finding evidence of someone being buried alive is very remote. However, mistakes are made, and people can be misdiagnosed as being dead when in fact they are still alive. Doctors are under pressure and work long hours, and occasionally they get it wrong. You've heard the testimony of those who have narrowly escaped death. We can only guess how many have gone to the grave alive.
3 times I have been pronounced dead.
I knew that the 2 bodies that were on either side of me were dead because they were covered in sheets apart from their feet.
The fact that I could have been put into that coffin when the hearse drew up at the door is frightening.
I'm not frightened of death. I'm terrified of ever being buried alive.
I was declared dead. I was put in fridge, and I was there for 3 days.
And then he came alive. It was a miracle.
Even I thought I was dead, but it's not so easy to kill George.
On Thursday night at 11, we continue our series of extraordinary people with the women with 7 personalities. We meet Helen, who suffers from multiple personality disorder.